Well, hello there, friends and foes, survivors and killers. Let's sit around the campfire together and talk about Dead by Daylight, specifically the notion of a psychopath, and how it applies to Dead by Daylight's cast of characters. I'd like to start this off by confirming that I'm not actually a psychiatrist. Me psychoanalyzing these characters is not the last word on them, and if anyone with better knowledge on this than me disagrees or notices a mistake I've made in my reasoning, then please do let me know. This isn't a hard and fast clinical diagnosis of video game characters. It's all just in good humour as an academic exercise. I also need to confirm I'm leaving the licensed killers from other franchises out of this, because they each have a lot to unpack from their own source material, with one exception I'm going to go over later. So let's start off with the groundwork. What is a psychopath? Psychopathy is a personality disorder hallmarked by antisocial behaviour and personality traits. Psychopaths in the media are almost universally portrayed as villains, and it's often used as a shorthand for evil, bad person who you can't sympathise with. But of course, there's a lot more to it than that. In the 1970s, Dr. Robert Hare published what has been referred to since as the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised, or PCLR for short. This is a list of 20 observable personality traits that a clinician will measure someone against to determine whether or not psychopath is an accurate diagnosis for their patient. This here is the list. And on it you'll see some things that shouldn't really surprise you when you're looking for definitions of a psychopath. Pathological lying, lack of remorse or guilt, and callousness and lack of empathy are classic psychopathic traits which we all instantly recognise. For each trait, the clinician rates their patient from 0 to 2, with 0 being this trait is not applicable, and 2 being this trait is completely applicable. Apparently an average person would score about 5 on this list, and a non-psychopathic felon with a criminal record would on average score at 22. The maximum score possible in the test is 40, which is the score of an absolute psychopath, but normally you have to have a score of 30 or more to be clinically diagnosed with psychopathy. But there's one personality trait I'd really like to examine up close on this list, and that's this one here. Grandiose self-worth. Or to put it bluntly, ego. No matter where you look, this is considered to be one of the clearest signposts for a psychopath. A typical psychopath has a keen self-preservation instinct and will always prioritise their own welfare above anything, because the ultimate goal in their life is preserving the thing most important to them, of themselves. That's not to say self-destructive behaviour is never displayed by a psychopath. Their impulsiveness might be so strong that it can overcome the desire for self-preservation, or they just might not be able to fully reason how to effectively protect themselves, meaning they shoot themselves in the foot. Before we get too off topic, I'd like to bring this back to Dead by Daylight by highlighting who I think is the ultimate psychopath among the cast, Danny Johnson, better known as the Ghostface. Besides revocation of conditional release, every single trait in this test applies strongly to our boy Danny. Parasitism, with how he jumped ship from Roseville as soon as the authorities are onto him, absolutely. Grandiose self-worth, he sees himself as some sort of celebrity killer, worthy of self-aggrandizing newspaper articles, so yes. Lack of realistic goals, all he really wants to do is hop from town to town terrorising people. I wouldn't really call that a realistic long-term goal. Danny Johnson is a textbook psychopath. I would also consider Kenneth Chase, aka The Clown, as well as Frank Morrison of the Legion, to be psychopath as well by the same metric. All three of them, despite their lack of long-term goals beyond keep doing what I'm doing, prioritise immediate gratification and self-preservation above everything else, and show absolutely zero regard for anyone else when seeking that gratification. This obsession with what's good for me and what I want indicates a seriously swollen ego, which is, once again, one of the cruxes of clinical psychopathy. There is one killer, I think, who, despite displaying some tendencies that overlap with psychopathy, would not be adequately diagnosed as a psychopath. I'm talking about Dr. Herman Carter. Don't get me wrong, the Doctor is an absolutely deplorable figure. I'm not saying he's some misunderstood anti-villain or anything, he's a monster, no question about it. But I don't think he's actually a psychopath, because he lacks that self-preservation instinct. The Doctor's number one priority isn't necessarily what's best for him, but instead, whatever would best serve his ambition to understand and master the human brain. Although he does clearly have a seriously huge ego, referring to his peers as sheep and imbeciles, he clearly has respect for others who share his ideology of knowledge at any cost, and has direct goals he works towards. From the Doctor's archive memories in the second tome, he clearly understands that experimenting on his classmates is actually detrimental to preserving his freedom. He makes a decision that the risk is worth it for the knowledge he'll gain from his few days of unrestrained curiosity. He even makes a contingency plan to mitigate that risk and protect himself from consequences, which is a level of foresight that I don't think the Ghostface or the Clown would be capable of. If it was Ghostface or the clown in the experiment room instead of the doctor, they'd probably just run away from the consequences of their actions, because that's the option that would give them the greatest chance of short-term self-preservation. Just like Danny ran from Roseville, or the clown ran away from his hometown and their murders were discovered. By setting aside a desire for self-preservation and short-term gratification, the Doctor proves while he is an egotistical and amoral monster with no sense of compassion or remorse, he's not actually a psychopath, because he believes and works for a goal even greater than himself. Instead, I would look to a subtly different condition if I was to try and diagnose the Doctor. Antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, is a behavioural disorder hallmarked by this list of different behaviours: failure to conform to social norms, impulsivity, reckless disregard for safety, deceitfulness, irritability, consistent irresponsibility, and lack of remorse. In his backstory and the archives tomes featuring him, the Doctor displays all or almost all of these behaviours. He refutes social norms by torturing his patients and disregards their safety by mentally reprogramming them for days on end. And he lies to Professor Blanchard about what actually happened during the farmhouse experiment. His frustration at the ethical constraints placed upon his research is apparent. The entire farmhouse experiment displays how irresponsible the Doctor can be, and is absolutely unapologetic for his methods, so long as he gets results. The only trait I would say the Doctor lacks here is impulsivity, as his long-term goal is quite clearly established. But he has some elements of capriciousness and childlike glee at his work, such as when he described the fun he had transplanting a mouse's brain into a rabbit. The key thing to remember here is that while the Doctor does display behaviour consistent with actions we'd see from a psychopath, he lacks probably the single most defining personality trait that separates a psychopath from someone with ASPD. An ego so huge it subsumes everything else about you. A psychopath demands instant gratification to please their ego, preserves themselves at all costs due to their self-importance, and doesn't consider consequences, since that would imply that someone of their grandeur has to worry about consequences. The Doctor definitely has a bit of a god complex, but not so much that it overtakes his grand aspirations and distracts from his end goal. And of course, there are several killers who don't fit these definitions at all. You don't have to be a psychopath for the entity to recruit you into its ranks of killers. In fact, many of the killers wound up in the entity's service precisely because they were formerly functioning, even upstanding members of society, broken by trauma and grief. I would say that the most tragic backstories among the killers were the ones where their humanity and goodness shone through, only to be beaten back down by other people or by misfortune, until the entity scoops up whatever's left of them and reshapes them in its image. I don't want to name any names here, but we'll cover the Plague's Law and why it's so tragic another day. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that was my little investigation into psychopathy in Dead by Daylight and how it's presented. If you liked it and want to see more content like this, please do subscribe. If you've got anything you want me to talk about, please leave it in the comments. I will be sure to look into it. The next video I'm going to do is probably going to be who is the protagonist of Dead by Daylight, so if you're into that, do subscribe, keep an eye out, and it's coming probably in the next week. Thank you, stay safe, and good night to you all.